Dr. Torange Khonsari, who is the co-founder and the director of a non-profit called Public Works, and they focus on architecture, art and urbanism to specifically do this, to further community development.
Talk about this kind of space that we've been in, since the late 90s, this kind of participatory. I didn't really know what we were doing, to be honest, at that time. There was like, is it public art? Is it engagement? Is it, a lot of that. So I would say a lot of my work has been experimenting in that space, which I would call the missing middle between the household and the state. So there is this other space, which I think actually has it's a very different political sphere than the top-down political sphere. So the top-down might be more bureaucratic, it's hierarchical, it's policy-led, it's all of that. The bottom, it's informal, it's interpersonal, messy, and territorial at times. There aren't governances there, so it's a very different kind of space. And so what over the years, what I've started to highlight is this difference. And if you are an architect embedded in that space, which doesn't have an economy, it's just a volunteering economy at the moment in that space. So it's precarious, but actually it's also the space where a lot of people don't people don't feel they're heard because of this missing middle, So a lot of work that I've been doing in very deprived neighbourhoods up and down the country, they really feel like, as an artist actually, they feel like nobody's listening, right? And so has that got much bigger implications to what we see today with the far right and a lot of these problems. So there is something, and so I became really interested in this notion of the architect from there, the political architect from the bottom, from the ground up, rather than the political architect who is aligned or works with government or with local authorities. I know both. but they're very different paradigms. So what has happened, and I'm going to go through these tiers actually now, actually in more detail here, because that's kind of the really important bit that gets from here to here. And the moment you get to here, then you're already on your way to kind of become, what are those things, like a common hold, a community development trust, a neighbourhood plan, these kind of larger neighbourhood scale governance models that can then partner with local authorities in order to start to have a community public partnership paradigm, rather than only working with developers and have a private public partnership, which we know a lot of social values are dodged. not always, but a lot of the times, more than if they work. But all of that is super complex, even from moving from here to here, then from here to here. These are really complicated, and we just don't have the infrastructure in place at the moment. So the reason I'm going to focus on this here is that there is skilling and learning that doesn't exist enough at that space. That doesn't exist in terms of how do you collaborate with public sector. They don't know how public sector operates. From my experience, I don't want to generalize it, but from my experience, there's a lack of understanding of procedures at public sector, but also how you work with each other. Anyway, I'll talk about those. Then what could the materiality of the commons be? And I'm going to just make a distinction here between the bounded commons. The bounded commons are when you're like in a community organization, in a consortium, in a community group, you know each other. So we could be in a commons, if we really develop it as one, because we know each other. Then you have the unbounded commons, which is the public. It's the crowd, it's the many. It's not so personal. So I think you can use the bounded commons, you can develop the bounded commons, federate them to support the unbounded commons. You with me? And so this is the development of the bounded commons to then be federated. That's a legal system for a federated commons at the neighbourhood scale. So when I then talk about could the neighbourhood, if we reimagine the state, could we see the neighbourhood and the urban environment of a neighbourhood as the nexus of political decision making if we're doing this, rather than the parliament? I know this is radical, but I'm going with it. But you know, it's, so if we're talking about decentralization, and if we're talking about decentralization within actually a lot of new emerging technologies such as blockchain, whether you like it or not, or things like that, then how does our institutional systems like catch up with that somehow? So, oh, that's a bad quality image. Anyway, so I just wanted to, this was like really stark for me when, this is a community garden we set up in 2006. And it came out of me kind of, it came out of me being told by a council to set one up and nobody wanted it in that community. And I thought, okay, let's try one where actually people want it and see what happens from the other way. So that was the first kind of questioning of the top down, bottom up. And then this is Westfield. So this was our event. And this was at same day, look how many people, you can count them with your fingers. And then I was in Westfield and I was like, okay, capitalism's won. You know, there's, what can I do here? Like, how can you shift this paradigm of value? Because whenever I was in these communities, they would go, oh, no, I'm sorry, Torange, I can't come because I'm really busy. And I'd be like, what are you doing? Going to Westfield? So I think there is an issue around values and how values have shifted in kind of neoliberal. So how do you shift that back? And that's why it's really tough to go from the non-engaged to become political. And so I'm now going to go through these. So through all of this engagements and finding, and I can do lots of anecdotal, if you like, afterwards, but I really started to see weird power relationships at community level, tenants and residents associations in conflict with each other, losing money because they're in conflict with each other, this and that. And I thought, oh my God, you know. So we kind of started to started to play with this idea of the School for Civic Action that has a very different pedagogy from the ground up. And we haven't had the resources to really push it, actually, but we started to think about neighbourhood curriculums, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then at the same time, I was looking, when I did the Design for Cultural Commons course, I was looking at this was more at that other tier of community organisations. They're no longer the non-engaged here. It's at the other level of organisations that needed training to set up governance structures, collaborative governance structures, collaborative ways of working, ethics of care, you know, lots of those kind of things that I might have something to talk about. But in terms of the School for Civic Action, you know, you can't go into a community and say, well, actually, I'm going to come and train you. So I think it has to come from within. So you have to start to see what kind of life skills, civic engagement skills, DIY, like household, like what are the skills that they don't recognize they have as skills, and slowly work with that. And I think it's been quite amazing, actually, because people, when you ask people, what is your skill, they go, I don't have anything, like, especially if they're very grassroots or just residents or residents. And as you start to have a conversation and I start filling this up and I kind of show it to them, there is a moment of pride, which I think is really interesting. And then we use that and turn them into courses with them to then train others in the neighbourhood. So it's kind of a way of kind of doing knowledge sharing. And so this, and this actually, so if you go, like, I can't talk about everything, but we did a project for Southwark Council, an art project, where we took the School for Civic Action out into the neighbourhood, and that basically the residents said there's an old laundry room, has been sitting empty, could we turn that into a room? Anyway, we can talk about the politics behind anything that's coming from the ground up, and, you know, officers in the council getting upset because they weren't asked, and blah, blah, blah. So it didn't happen, so we had to kind of create a mobile float to kind of do this work. And so there is also a lot of expertise and knowledge in the communities that are just not captured. So the School for Civic Action was really to also capture this other knowledge that is not legitimized or sanctioned as knowledge, but actually people are doing things using that knowledge. And then the School for Civic Action, again, sorry, another diagram. There's going to be a lot of diagrams. Just if something is unclear, just ask me, please. But I set up this where it had these modules of doing peer-to-peer institutional and system design. So it was all about horizontal systems, so nothing from top-down systems. But what are social artifacts and services if, again, if they're being created within the bounded commons? They're going to be quite different because they're not going to be in the commercial system necessarily, or the public system getting paid for by the state. So what is this thing within this missing middle? What is the materiality? What is that? And then inclusive engagement methods and so on. And the interesting thing, I had to shift it so many times because it wasn't recruiting. You know, people were like, what is this thing? And then as soon as I closed the course, I'm like, what's happened to your course? I'm like, okay, anyway. But the interesting thing was that it created a PhD program. And so, because they were like community organizations or people who wanted to go into that commons sector, there are like 20 or 30 alumni who have gone out there and have set up commons projects and are working in a commons public partnership mode. So now I have to, so that was, for me, it was a project. It wasn't actually, it was a course, but it was a project to see how you can expand the movement of the commons. And so now with my AA students, I'm thinking, okay, maybe I put the AA students into their projects so they can be peer mentored by those students. So how do you grow this, you know, in a way within that system? And the conference we had, like financing the commons, what could be the financial system? I'm working with Sue and some others, because it doesn't have an economy at the moment. It has to have an economy. We have to be able to work in it. We have to be able to, it can be non-for-profit, the profit can be put back into the system, but I think it can't be volunteering, it's precarious. It has to be that we want to work in it. And then the material one, sorry, again, but I'll go into stuff in a minute. So this is kind of really critically looking at, so what is the raw material? You know, where is that coming from? Is it recycled? Is it from neighbourhood? Is there a common pool resource of materials, you know, with upcycling groups, maker spaces, whatever it might be, or that they're regenerative materials, so that they are actually building our unbounded commons, supporting our unbounded commons, which we're talking about it anyway, but and it doesn't have to be in here. The raw material bit, it can be commercial and it can be public and it can be, but this idea of actually making things, and through the making you start to connect and make relationships with others through the making process, rather than fabricating something in a factory and then bringing it, is a really interesting one for the commons, because commons is about building of relationships. That's at the core, I think that's the core at the heart of it. So you have to understand relationships. And so what happens, and this is kind of a bit like what happens if we're producing common pool resources. So for example, and I'll talk about that through a project in a minute, but for example, at the moment we're talking to Camden, Haringey and Islington, like, could we create a material development trust that actually starts to create a common pool resource? I mean, it's a conversation. We haven't done it yet completely, but it's a conversation we're having. And if you do that, what can you make? Like, what does that mean? You know, what does that mean if we, because it becomes more viable the bigger these pools become. And that goes to Elinor Ostrom's Governing the Commons, of how you actually manage common pool resources. And then, you know, critical reflection on the materials we're using. You know, again, in some teaching I did at the Royal College, we like unpacked aluminium, for example, and did a cartography of one single material and what kind of catastrophic kind of implication that had for just a little bit of aluminium. So then what does that become? Do we go back to the raw? And then what is its planetary impact or its exchange? So I just want to show, this is a tiny project, because I wouldn't call this a piece of architecture, I would call this a one-to-one model, actually. So this was a project where a community group on Roman Road came to us and said, we want to have responsibility for how our high street gets developed. And could you come and help us with your students? And I, you know, from art practice, I was like, okay, we want to be students in residence, so we want to be connected and we want to be there. I tried, couldn't get a shop for love or money, and then found this site, which is owned by Clarion Housing Association. And the students designed this thing, and it was all about thresholds and, you know, the guest and the host. And I talk about that forever in my book, but, well, not forever, but the thing was that just by putting that up there, for me, that's a modeling process in a social context, because you've put the thing there and then all sorts of things happened. You know, people were making love behind there, or shooting up, or then there was shooting up and making love. So there was like all sorts of things that happened. Then these neighbours called and said, put a gate here. You know, this can't happen. So then, you know, okay, fine, we want to keep a relationship with the landowner. So I know we could have thought that, but I think still it was quite important to understand what the social dynamics are, because they could have just done something else. And so this was supposed to be like a space that there's art exhibitions and whatever. Also, that was our hypothesis. It's going to be this threshold and it's occupied, you know, how architects think. And we're going to like occupy it and have exhibitions and everybody's going to be so happy. Nobody wanted to use it like that. So it became a gate and a gate. And I think those things are actually quite interesting in terms of testing. But what people said was, we want a room to actually do stuff, not in your poxy little threshold. We want to do it in a room behind. So I started to have my tutorials and lessons here and put a board out going free architecture training. And this, then I think this idea of this was made between the students and the residents. And so we basically, this was what they wanted and we collectively made it. We had lunch and dinners as we were doing it. And so it started to create a community through the building process. So that's what I mean. But, you know, that's not anything new. I mean, a lot of us do that. But what was really interesting is at the same time, I went to a conference at UCL and they were talking about Savills' report, Completing London Streets, which was about now taking over every little land. Okay, for housing, but you know, anyway, we're not going to start that conversation. But I started to think, okay, we need land for the commons. We need land which isn't just taken and just captured in that way. So I started to create this report with all the activity that was happening, and somehow the asset manager at Clarion was at that conference, saw me speak. I was like, I just let the cat out of the bag what I'm doing. But she was completely fine with it. And then basically said, you can have the space to then create the permanent structure. So this was funded by the GLA. Why are my pictures such bad quality? Sorry. It was funded by the GLA, and now that piece of land, so the permanent architecture was to actually claim land for the commons, the unbounded commons, as land. So it kind of then became a methodology for me that we can kind of actually use this as a way to protect public land through universities. So through universities, and that's what we're doing at the AA at a much larger scale now. And actually, and it's a really small space, but lots of big things happen. Like you can have a small space with big impact. So the neighbourhood plan was already in the temporary bit, started to we supported them to do the neighbourhood plan, the policies. Okay, it has problems, but that's because of the financing of the missing middle, not because we don't have the legislation. It's because it's not funded for us to really run a neighbourhood plan. But also, I don't know if you know LJ Works, but that was a similar process, but much bigger building. So it was also using tactics to temporarily occupy the space, bringing communities together, showing the value. And what is really interesting is that then you start to suddenly, in something that felt impossible, of transformation of land value from purely commercial, manage to become social or ecological. So suddenly they were going to sell this for private housing. And it's fine if it's properly social housing, I don't mind. But anyway, let's not start that conversation. But, how much of it is really... but we also can't have city that's completely housing. You also need these other spaces. So how do we have this otherness? So this is the and so in the LJ Works, I think what Lucy was referring to was this big image that actually started to show all of that dynamics of the social dynamic that was actually created this transformation of land value. And so what does it mean? So this would be the way we would do an architectural imagery, because it's all of the impact that was needed in order for the physical building to happen. And the physical building is always, there's never enough money. There's, so it is whatever you can do with whatever you can do. But actually, what is the richness of it comes from all these other things, or other activities, events. And so we can't be so closed in a disciplinary way that it's only the architectural object or artifact that we look at, but actually there's anthropology, there's sociology, there's psychology, there's politics, there's all of these kind of different things that happens around the city or around a piece of land. And this was really it was more polemic in terms of we need a Ministry of Common Land. So land becomes this very, very important material in this notion of the architect from the ground up. And anyway, we can talk about details of how that intersects and with the public sector and the power discomforts or how you get through it. But anyway, also just in terms of engagement, you can also look at engagement in different scales. You could look at engagement at the intimate scale, which is really listening, so going into a community, really listening, not coming in going, this is what I want to do, and what do you think? It's not about that. It's really about listening what it is that they need, and you start to have a reciprocal relationship. And so it becomes a collaboration. We don't do things to people. It becomes about, so you have to build trust, and that takes a year. I can tell you that right now. It takes a year to do that, and it's very fragile. And so that is kind of that. The public events are more when you're in an area and you don't know anybody, and it's like, let's do a public event and then see who's there. It's a kind of, these are all different kind of, I think community engagement is a craft actually, but it's not being framed as a craft, or not been even written about as a craft. So, and it's something that is just like a craft that when you do a bowl, you can't teach it in a very precise way. You know, you have to do it. They have to do it, and you feel it, and so on. And then there are the political. So this is the assembly that we did in the Roman Road. These are all kind of in the Roman Road where we introduced neighbourhood planning. And so it started the process. But the interesting thing was there were people who would not have come to this if we hadn't done that. So we basically took them with us. So again, when we're talking about the transition from the non-engaged to the engaged, it's quite a process. So, you know, intimate events were also done in, like, as part of public art projects. God, why are my images like this? And then the way that we do our feasibility studies, you know, we do them as commissions from public sector, but these all came from the bottom, or a lot of them came from the bottom. So the voice, the expertise is reversed, or you become a curator, you become a facilitator of different voices, and of course you put the language of public sector onto it and give it the legitimacy, right? So these are the legitimacy that then were tools that got the land, you know, and got the projects happening. And just finally, I only have two more slides. You'll be happy to know. So the other form is the form of the practice. If you're really a commons practitioner, as a verb is everything I've talked about. It's the way we do architecture, or the way we do urbanism as a verb. So it's what we teach, actually, but we don't teach the noun, which is what's the form or structure of the organisation. Because the structure of the organisation, or what it is, exactly what it is, in an interdisciplinary way, allows you to do this type of practice. So they're linked, but we don't teach them as a linked thing. So what happens if we have the idea of a place-based organisations, you know, rather than you have an organisation and you're everywhere, you know? So I don't know. Actually, I can't say I know, but that's some of our students have been working, who are also in public works now, are directors in public works, but they've been working like LJ Works in an area in that place for 10 years. So what happens if you have the permanent architect but temporary architecture? You know, what kind of values do you bring? So in that sense, you become an expert facilitator, perhaps. You'll understand what localized systems of production are. You're doing capacity building. You're doing resource development. So actually with the common room, when we undid that back room, we took all of that threshold space and all the wood went to Adventure Playground behind, the threshold went to create a bee space in another community garden. So actually there isn't circular system that the materials moved. So I think looking at that circular economy or a circular system of material within a neighbourhood, I think is also really important. But then you become a designer of that system as well. You know, so as architects, or urban practitioners or built environment practitioners, we don't have to all do the same thing. You know, we have the strategic expertise to actually do a lot of different things. So the incentive for design to stay engaged, so is that if you're talking about making as connecting, then designing local events, implement social environment. And so the other thing with public works is that we hardly have any employees, but we're all directors. So the way that works is that and we say to people that you can, as you develop your own very specific interest based on the manifesto of the practice, and you can have your own style. That's why when you go onto our website, it looks a bit of a mess, but that's on purpose, that everybody can actually have their own aesthetic. It's not a house aesthetic that's imposed from the top by us. So and so you have your own, and then you pitch for those projects. You can use the archive of public works however you want to generate work. You just have to put 20% into the collective pot, so it keeps the company going. And it's not without its problems, by the way, but it means that it's a flat horizontal system. And actually, one thing we haven't finessed yet is how to have a system of membership. So we work with other younger practices and organizations, a bit like the Design Council operates, you know, and you work horizontally rather than capturing everything and enclosing it into your organizations or into your system. So you actually open the threshold or the boundary out and actually support and collectivize others who want to do this kind of work, rather than, you know, so you know, you're creating like a movement or a solidarity group. So then, you know, rather than a private-public partnership, and this comes from Kate Raworth's Donut Economics as well, you start to have a tripartite collaboration. Nobody has to vie in for power. It's all about the private, like Trump, or it's all about the state, or, you know, these kind of dogmatic kind of positions are not, they're all different logics. One is about business, you know, and money and commercialization. One is regulatory and, you know, supporting justice, you know, at a legal level. And the other one is about people, you know, and they are not about people so much, because there's so much bureaucracy, and the people actually is elsewhere. So I think that is really, really important, that we keep these distinctions and actually do it really well and see where those lies. What is the quality of the relationships actually? And that's it. I don't know. Was that?
Thinking about LJ Works, which is at Loughborough Junction, so presumably within the borough of, we will say,
that's it.
the borough of Lambeth.
Yeah.
It's a pilot, and was it originally perceived to be akin to meanwhile use, with the idea that if it's a successful pilot, it then becomes a longer-term permanent facility to incubate a local economy? How successful do you deem it to have been?
So
just to get a sense of a local project, and was Lambeth involved in any shape or form? Were they happy to just let you get on with it?
Well, I think actually Tom Dobson is the one who
Your
would
colleague,
really, my colleague, who would really know that in and out. So I can't say I'm an expert on it, but I think what it was that we, like Tom, supported, actually put the bid to the GLA for the Good Growth Fund. And of course, every local authority is very happy when they get a Good Growth Fund, and they'll match fund it. It wasn't without its problems, you know, again, bureaucratic stuff getting in the way, and that could be, again, Tom would know this better, but that could be, I don't know, just getting stuck because they've run out of money, because the way that they would spend the money is 30% more, and, you know, it's just doing a path, and the community kept saying, we'll just do it, you know, can we just do it? And they were like, no. So again, I think there, but it wasn't that they just let us get on with it. But I mean, I think we've done quite a few like that, where we've generated it from the bottom, going for the Good Growth Fund. I mean, the little room was also from the mayor's crowd fund. So I think these, they're a bit more complicated and messy when they're from the ground up, but actually they have a real buy-in, you know, in a way. So the council. So that's why I think the public commons partnership is so interesting, because if you had come up with an idea that this should be this kind of civic space, and then you have to run it and fund it as a council, and then not everybody, actually it's not so public, because like conceptually public, but you know, even a community centre, there's so much turf war over one space, you know, and then the council, the councils kind of then say, okay, well, whoever can operate it, and then that operator has all the power. So it's not so clean as sometimes, like we talk about civic space. Civics, they're messy, you know, and I think that messiness is not understood always, I feel, by architects. You know, so there's always a utopian idea of a civic building.
Is it true to say that architects, even in these very times where we need to be quite pragmatic, are still actually they're pretty utopian? I mean, you did this project together with the other very renowned architectural collective, Architecture 00.
Yeah.
So there was a huge number of you, and you've all, you know, you've long since cut your teeth on many other earlier projects that are very socially grassroots. So it's not like you were coming in green around the, as they say, you know, very sort of green to what some of these challenging issues were.
Yeah, I mean, also the Lepsy Exchange by Ulrika, you know, by Ulrika, you know, that's another one, which is, you know, from the ground up. And you know, the participatory city one we did. I mean, there's a lot, like most of ours are like that, but they are, you have to, it's a different skill set, because you have to really understand politics and local politics and how you maneuver it, and the politics at the top, and I think, how do you collaborate rather than be a service provider to a local government? And I think that's not so much out there. I think it's much more out there that you become a service provider to the state or to the developer, but not so much that, okay, it's murky who the client is, you know, and it's like you're collaborating with the council, you're collaborating with local authority, people on the ground. So actually, maybe there shouldn't be the hierarchy of a client. I would just get rid of that. You know, especially at a time where, you know, RIBA keeps talking about now we can't even, you know, walk away from a client. So actually, you know, maybe they should just become an association for clients. I mean, you know, in a way, so what these hierarchies are not useful, maybe. And we have contracts, we have collaborative contracts. Why don't we do them? You know, so okay, they're also complicated, but anyway.
Do you get at the SIL money, the community infrastructure level for the neighbourhood plats?
Well, it's not up to us, no. So it's decided by local authorities so they all structure it slightly differently.
I thought they were supposed to put their 15 or 25% out exactly for the neighbourhood to do what they want.
Yeah, but it really depends how they cut. Like, there isn't a hard line of how you do it, and I think a lot of it after the SIL, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, went into more of a collective pot of the local authority than actually being spent in local areas, I think. Section 106, I think, was more that you would spend it in where the development was happening.
But I'm aware that local authorities do have a habit of keeping the big pot and the interest from that big pot that goes into their main. But they actually are supposed to be paying that out.
They probably do, but the thing is, they're not so keen on bottom-up stuff. Always. So, you know, if you say, you know, it has to be, it's not. It's that thing that I talked about, keeping it within the institution, so you can talk about the values that you're giving. And if you can't give it, then that's why a lot of community groups say, you know, we're not going to talk to the council anymore because they just capture our value and then just say it's theirs. And the reason for that is that if you can't deliver it, then you have to capture it to say you're delivering it. So then for me, that's actually interesting, because I think, okay, something's wrong, mate. You know, there's something wrong that you have to do that. So either you don't have the capacity or your system's broken. So how do we redesign that?
Have you ever been brought in to troubleshoot a situation? Because when you were talking, it made me think of Opposite Everton football ground in Liverpool is a street where Homebake Community Land Trust, by your definition, they fit into the bounded commons.
Yes.
Because they're more aligned to the local authority. Local authority, Liverpool, gave them all the houses along one whole stretch of street in order to repurpose them as they wanted to. Until, and it was all going hunky-dory until I saw in the local paper that they'd fallen out, and
with the
council claimed back the houses. Now that they put in, I mean, who knows how it all went wrong, but
wonder if the land value went up.
Could you not create a sort of troubleshooting crack team where you go in and make sure these people don't fall out with each other?
Yeah, no, but that's what I think
Since
the
you have
role
a great
of
knowledge of politics.
But that's why I think that that is to me the role of the bottom-up architect.
Yeah.
Well, I think we need. I can't do everything, you know. It can't be me. But I think that's what I think is the role of the bottom-up architect, because you really have to be skilled enough to be able to. And there's so many, like, guys, we have 4,000 students almost. I mean, I don't have it just from architecture students graduate a year. We can't all be building buildings, you know, and not that we are, but I think there is such a varied roles that we can play.
It really resonates with me. I'm at the London School of Architecture in my second year, so in the thick of it right now. But my whole research has been on the Commons, and I've really struggled to, because the school really pushes you to have like a built outcome to meet the requirements, and I've really struggled to navigate kind of the thesis and the thinking behind the project and how it resolves in the end.
It's a lot for a student to take on. You know, I struggle as a teacher to navigate that and push that forward, and sometimes have to throw a hissy fit. But I think I think it needs to become a thing, because not only more students want to do it, and at the moment, like I've been to London School of Architecture where I said to a student, why didn't you do that? They're like, I'm not allowed. So, I don't want to, God, it's filming. I don't want to single out London School of Architecture. It's also other schools that this happens. So I think we need to kind of, it's not in people's familiarity of how to deal with that. They haven't been trained to teach. I had to unlearn a lot, you know, and I think that's,
My question is about the materiality of the commons and say like an archetype like the urban room. To what extent do you think that each one needs to be co-designed and co-produced to be successful? Or could the end goal be the creation of those, let's say, 4 walls and a roof to create that space for the commons?
I actually think the co-design thing, I don't think many people want to co-design buildings, actually. You know, like there might be people who are interested. Like when I did that room, it was really hard. Nobody wants to build stuff other than architects or you know, makers, right? So actually the co-designing, a lot of people want to use it and they want to co-design how it's used, and that they have something that that they can offer. So I think the best thing is that listening thing, is to see what is it that people actually want, or not just in that way as well, but actually what is the need. So in Archway, I mean, I didn't talk about the Islington project because it's really ongoing, so maybe in a couple of years' time. But with that one, just by listening what people needed, like all these cultural organisations which are doing incredible grassroots, they're charities, they can't afford the rent. So they're all going bust. They can't afford rent. So as an architect, like a conventional one, you would just go, okay, I can't afford rent, I'm off. But I'm like, land justice. Like, how do we get land? So I literally go to Islington saying, what is your land? Like, what do you have here? Did you sell that too? Did you sell that too? Oh my God. And then what they say to me is, we've got lots of community centres in Islington. I'm like, yes, but you can't host a performance arts school in a community centre. So that we need different type of land. And one of the interesting things that's coming out is that actually these community centres, you have to first of all sort all their turf wars, but then they become quite interesting incubators for like social organisations that are very embedded in the local neighbourhood. But then where do they go afterwards? They still, and I think this whole narrative that these places have to make money is ludicrous. Ludicrous, because how the hell do you want a community centre in the middle of a weird housing estate to make money? Like, it just won't. And also its audience are people who are struggling or, you know, so again, I'll go back to that diagram, maybe that's better to be up, to this diagram, that these are different things, you know. And so we have to find different financial models that can actually operate. You can't make these be a financial profit, big profit making. It just won't happen, you know. And so they keep saying it because we're in a neoliberal paradigm. But then it's just not fit for purpose, that you know, that kind of mindset that came with Thatcher is just not fit for purpose. And we're seeing it. Well, I think you have to see who wants to co-design what.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking from the perspective of a council, there's a big appetite for co-design, co-production, but also a big fear because it takes a long time.
Yeah.
And in a context of a place like Westminster, for instance, you know, local elections are looming and the jury of public opinion is out whether Labour will stay in or not.
Yeah.
So there's a nervousness around co-production that it will take too long.
Yeah.
And I think there might be an interest in something a bit more off the shelf that can be tinkered with by the local community. So I guess my question was like, to what extent?
That becomes too tokenistic then, I think. And I think in that sense, it's maybe just better not. Because then it sounds like co-design, then it gives co-design a bad rep. And so in a way, I think it depends on the scales. So, for example, I've just supported our Vice-Chancellor at London Met to co-design the strategy for the university and have involved all the stuff. I mean, she's amazing. And it's been a most fantastic experience, and it hasn't taken that long, 2 weeks. You know, but that's with staff, and we have to then, and I can tell you afterwards how we did it, because I'm more than happy for anybody to use the model. But so it depends how you design the co-production model. So I think it's the design of it that matters. And so part of the restriction could be we have this much time. So if somebody can really do the co-design properly, then that's part of the brief, right?
So in other words, are you saying that the making of the commons is a requisite aspect of the commons? Like, you have to make it in order for it to be...
You have to make it.
Okay.
You have to produce it.
You cannot just ring fence it and say, hand over the keys.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly. Well, again, that has to be a commons as well. You know, so you can hand over the keys, but they have to be capacity built to be able to manage the commons as a commons. Mm-hmm. But we've lost the commons, like in terms of the bounded commons and the bigger commons. So we have to reproduce them, you know, so all the regenerative paradigm for me is part of that paradigm of recreating the commons in a way. So, but we need a sphere of work, actually, to recreate the commons. And actually, with all the AI and all this new technology and other jobs that are going to get lost, we can invent, like the World Economic Forum's report for jobs by 2030 or whatever. We don't even know what jobs there will be in 2030. We don't even know what they would look like, really. So in a way, we have to grapple with all that as education. So in a way, I think it's a fantastic time to innovate, you know, and rethink and move away from these silos and power, blah, blah.
And I don't know, I'm not an architect, I know several, but I'm wondering if architects begin to look at not just building buildings. And my understanding is that an architect designs something, and then in the construction it gets reorganized to become a reality, in a sense. So what I'm wondering is if new architects begin to look at not just creating the architecture of a building, but the architecture of how you create commons.
Yes.
And that means including the architecture of the social environment, so
Yes.
the people around. So you create skills which help to facilitate, create skills that help to create structure. I mean, I've worked with sociocracy now for a couple of decades or something, which is a structure and processes which include everyone. And it doesn't have the right answer, because the reality is there isn't one at the moment. We're co-creating completely different kinds of ways of being, working, living together. Maybe architects begin to take the responsibility for helping people to do that as well. I mean, I'm working in Brixton, so just up the road from LJ Works. And we're now beginning, because a part of the work I'm doing is trying to create a community network where we don't have to go. And in some ways, some of these crises are really helpful. Volunteering, increasingly young people are saying, I'm not volunteering, basically. People, unless I get some kind of return. So volunteering is not happening. The philanthropic funders are saying, I'm going to have to think about this, you know? And the councils are like, what do we do now?
Yeah.
So if there's a way in which we can concretely experiment, be allowed to experiment, and that means, because so often what happens is that community organisations get together and they recreate no, this is our job kind of thing. This is our boundary, and this is not a commons boundary. This is I'm in charge boundary.
No, it's an enclosure.
Sadly. And what we're looking at doing at the moment, which is a really crazy idea, partly because the community networks have developed it, along with the Bureau of Silly Ideas, which is an architecture organisation. We're looking at helping young people and also older people, which might be female, although I hope we get some young females as well, to do construction plus DIY skills, that kind of thing. Plus also we'll need to include some digital skills. And then it doesn't matter how wonderful your construction or DIY skills are, unless if you're going to turn that into a business, unless you're able to go into a person's home and negotiate a business. So it's actually the people skills that are required with it. We actually now looking at creating an organisation, and I already have some links with people who got this from, agreed by the Financial Conduct Authority, where we could actually, the community plus its residents own the community centre. So they don't have to pay rent for it, they don't have to evidence to anybody what they're doing. Mostly this is kind of below the parapet, we're kind of experimenting with it. And of course, in getting funding, they're then kind of, the funders are saying, like, oh, mummy and daddy says you can only have the money if you do this, this, this and this, which is funders again. So in a way it's experimental. And the more challenging in a way that we think about it, and the more we listen to people's crazy ideas, the more likely we're going to actually be able to create it. So it's so good to have you
Crazy
around.
ideas.
It's so good to have you around. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to add that I really liked how you kind of turned a negative when you spoke about how the residents obviously didn't like people shooting up behind their installation. And I think if I was in that situation that I'd designed something, I would panic that would be it. And I think that's really positive that you can show that you can turn that into an opportunity to make people feel listened to.
I think you can turn everything into a positive, actually. It's just a mindset, so just don't ever be afraid.
Affordable housing kind of follow up on that. There's the idea of planned obsolescence of that original structure, and it's almost, would you look back on it as something which you'd do again to make an intervention into a space which gives something for people to coalesce around as something they don't like, and therefore prompts a community reaction in that way? Because most people, if you know, as you say, you're looking at the Westfield model of everyone's out there shopping and there's no one that you're engaging with them. But you put something into a space for people to hate, and then they're immediately engaged and they're sort of back of that process. Is that something that was designed in, considered later, or that you would do again?
Well, I think that's just, you have to be so good at conflict resolution, because that's the agonism thing of Chantal Mouffe, isn't it? Like you start, and I always read her and I think, oh God, you haven't done this, have you? So, because it's really hard to. So I can give you an example. So we did a project for Telford Homes. Oh God, we're filming this still. Okay, we did a project for Telford Homes as part of a public art strategy. I didn't think about this at the beginning, but I used that model of let's be in residence. So we got Telford to put a container. We called it a public living room with art projects. There were the consultants on it, and I just said, okay, it's a consultation, and I had nothing about the proposal or the design, and people literally came and went, where is it? Where is it? Where's the stuff? Where's the design? And I was like, have a tea, sit down, let's have a chat. And it was so nice, as a process, because people were coming, so it's exactly what you're saying. But then, and I was like, I'm not presenting the building. I just do the tea bits, and had all the kind of conversations. And what was really interesting in that situation, and again, I didn't know because it's all action research. I don't really know what's going to happen because every situation is different. But what happened, we started to then get people starting to understand, it became a research method, starting to understand lots of community groups in Rotherhithe, but actually none of them have a common pool resource, which might be a website where they actually say that they have all these spaces to rent. So they're all trying with very little money, And so we did a lot of the mapping of what was actually missing in the community using the statutory consultation process. And then there were amazing stories, like people who came and told us that they've been living somewhere for 30 years because it was a housing co-op, and they fought for a housing co-op. And then the other person saying the gas holder that's on the site can become a magnetic thing that takes all the blah, blah. So people started to come up with weird proposals about the site that would have been much more interesting, actually. But of course, the architects were not all interested. So we were the pest to the architects. It's like, oh my God, here they come again with something else. So I think it's, but actually, if I was the architect on it, I don't know, some of the stuff I would have taken on. But so we left thinking, actually, if we do this again, it has to be with architects that we can work with and are aligned, because there are many. Because then actually something really interesting could have happened, which Telford would have been on, it's not like stupid ideas or silly ideas. Maybe some of them were. But yeah, so I think you can, but you have to be, like, literally we were talking, Up Projects and me, we're talking every day, tactically and strategically what was happening and how we deal with it. So you have to be really on it if you do something like that. Yeah.
There's a lot of the principles that you work with are women-centric societies principles. This non-hierarchical and participatory and creating that sense of belonging and the playfulness. And of course, from the perspective of patriarchy, it's all very messy.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you hold those principles as a women, kind of creating also solidarity within the commons.
Yeah. So I would probably not gender it. I would say it's feminist thought. And I think it can be men or women adopting it. Yeah.
Those societies are also for men and women, but the structure is non-hierarchical.
The thinking, the thought is because I mean, if we're really crass and make it very simplistic, you know, the feminist is about connectivity, and the non-feminist patriarchal is about separation, right? So that's why we have the legal system, you know, and that's what that is structured on, the state. The state model is all about, like, the justice-based ethics is duties and obligations. No, it's all like everything's there. Whereas
this also can grow to bring those into responsiveness and make it more of a kind of alive organism.
Absolutely. But I think that's why I think this one is more a very different system. And by actually occupying that, getting them to work with each other, you'll start to influence the others, but not by forcing the others. I think by actually creating this commons public partnership, you'll start to, I mean, I can see it already happening in Islington, you know, that there is very different policy changes from that. But it takes, like, that is a lot of work, which you can't do volunteering. It's skilled work, you know, it's architects' work.
Because we are a social being, so I think we maybe unlearned it, but we can remember it, you know, so that gives me a lot of hope. So now we have to bring this into architectural education, but if the state pulls back a little bit, you know, with all this pressure that is going on and economic, global geopolitical change that are going on, will give space for communities to rise, basically. So I see a hopeful future for commons.
Yeah, and I think we have to also really get away from the dogmatic left-right division. Exactly. This is a really problematic paradigm because actually then, you know, for example, we miss a lot. So the Localism Act, I actually really like the Localism Act, I don't care. But if I say that to my lefty friends, I'm like, neoliberal, blah, blah. But for God's sake, it's a legal framework that you can use and then mature it and make it really, like, a lot of really interesting policies in there are not being used. They're just not being used. So community charters, that, like, literally they're being done from the top down by developers or local authorities. It's not being done as the Localism Acts. And so there are lots of really interesting common hold, really interesting. You know, take it. You know, I mean, it's really innovative. So I don't care that the Conservative Party made it. You know, they also made the cooperatives, didn't they? I mean, I don't know. Somebody told me that. So I think we have to also get rid of this paradigm. And I think what was so inspiring for me from our Vice-Chancellor was, again, that thing of the feminist leader where she said, oh, I've been told that I have to tear up the last strategy and make my mark and create my, you know, make my stamp or make my... And she was like, rubbish. I'm going to take that one because her strategy was really good, the one before, the Vice-Chancellor before, going to evaluate it, reflect on it, see what's worked, build on it. If our governments did this, rather than throwing everything out of the window, going, oh, I have 5 years to do this. Well, why? Just take the stuff that works. We know what the problems of the world are. What are you talking about? We know we have a climate crisis. We know we have a social inequality problem. Take that, you know, whoever's in power, you know, take it and see how you do it. And then if you build, then you will actually make the proper change. And, you know, I mean, I don't know if you guys know, but the Ruhrgebiet area, when they closed all the industries and now have become all these cultural spaces, they basically said, this is a 20-year project. No matter what the political politics is. We're just going to do this, and it's amazing. Right? There's a lot. I mean, I think sometimes when I see, I mean, there's a massive fund, government fund for renewal, for urban renewal, isn't there, for places, for levelling up. And the way they're talking about it, that's just going to fall flat because because there isn't, like, I actually think local authorities don't also know how to do it. And I mean, I can't tell you from top of my head, you know, because it has to be the situation you have to, but I would go in like that. As a professional, say somebody has to do this for 5 years. It's not like we commission someone for 3 months to find out how to do, like a consultancy. So it could be that they partner with universities, or, you know, it has to be a bit creative thinking that, you know, with sociology or whatever, anthropology or different kind of schools, go in, they start with listening, you know, like really community development. None of the courses in community development recruit. They're closing community development courses. It's ridiculous, you know. So I think it's that, you know, marry those people, like create interdisciplinary, force universities to create interdisciplinary classes, get architects, anthropologists, political scientists, economists to kind of come in these areas. Urban rooms or whatever can do that, or living labs, you know, that's another kind of framework that can be used. But really, we have them, they're just all disparate, you know, and they just need a little bit of creative connecting the dots and just really knowing that it's slow, you know, and you don't have to fund it all, you know, you just have to be a partner, you know.
Or commons pooling. Or, I think half year ago we met Yasmin Lari. She was here from Pakistan, and she spoke about like how to fund through commons young architects. And she thought a community could bring, like make a pot and put money to pay those to do these works. So basically, because it was this volunteering and things like that. So there are models already, people, and she's doing amazing work in Pakistan. So.
Yeah, you can have funds, you can have neighbourhood funds, you know, and crowdsource. And it's easier in more affluent places, might not be so easy in, you know, outskirts of
So that's exactly what she was saying, because she said these kids who are architects, they are mostly from affluent families. So they will be able to kind of support or make all kind of ways of funding, making this
amazing
pot. And they will fund those people for a while, at least till it becomes a way that can like fund itself or whatever.
Amazing.
So there are people thinking about
No, I think there's a lot, actually. I mean, Sue, who was just speaking, I think she's working a lot around Credit Commons, and so I think there's a lot of discussion. I think I'm very hopeful. I think things are going to happen. Don't be despondent. It's because it can be, you know, when you look outside and you see politics and climate and you go, oh my God. But I would say Promethean cracks. Small cracks. If we all do little cracks and embody and occupy those cracks and just kind of do this, we make change. You don't have to do big things. This is 25 years.
Definitely.
Sorry.
And if you consider globally, I see an awful lot of tremendous projects such as you've described. In informal settlements in the global south. Where they are not deterred by anything whatsoever.
No, absolutely.
And you could become Minister of Commoning Practice.
Then I'll be from the top.
Alongside Matthew Pennycock, who we hope as housing minister.
Then I'll become a bureaucrat.
Will stay.
I can be a bottom-up minister.
Can you be a bottom-up bureaucrat?
I lead a small architecture school here in London, and since I took on the role, the projects that we try to do in our curriculum are related to working with communities and having some level of social impact. And learning through the journey that I don't have your incredible and phenomenal experience. Obviously, there is a lot about listening, and there is a lot about trying to gain that trust, which in academia, in a small institution, we find that it's very difficult to build that time, because by the time that you are creating that, the students have to progress, and then you feel that sometimes you have to reset everything. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, what do you think about it? But one of the things that the NHS was supporting us in one of the projects with a community in the southeast of London, in Plumstead, that they wanted to figure it out how to get more traction on reducing the existing building but protecting it. And you know, you get lots of community members coming with an amazing background, but I found that it was very difficult to manage, because they ended even arguing in most of the occasions. And my suggestion for the people leading in the NHS is like, why we don't do some kind of leadership programs for that and them. And I think that we're talking a lot about the role of the architect, for example, that I think is a very long discussion, where from government, professional bodies, and many aspects that could be discussed there. But what could you say in your experience about that bit? Because my opportunity to take on there was like, why we don't train these people? Because these people have lots of ambitions and expectations also, which is challenging, but is normal.
That's
as
where
human
my
beings.
learning commons came in. That it needs a curriculum, you know, even so. But how do you get them to that level of wanting to sit there? So I think that in itself is sometimes a journey, because there's lots of complications, whether they've never been, you know, there's lots of complications. So, you know, they don't want to sit in a classroom, or, you know, there's lots of kind of different, you have to find creative ways in which kind of knowledge is exchanged, transferred, and a lot of it can happen through practice. So the first thing I would say in a situation like that is developing a terms of engagement in a space. And so the terms of engagement is, you know, whatever it is, like everybody gets to speak, but nobody can. And a lot of, and I think we have to also understand psychology, because sometimes it comes from not having a voice, then they want to shout, then the more they shout, the less everybody hears them. So, but sometimes I just say that. I'm not in the crowd, because then you embarrass them, but I'll just kind of pull people aside. So that's what I mean in the terms of the craft. So I pull people, you know, out and say, you know, what was that all about? You know, that's not really useful, is it? You know, like, and you just have that kind of conversation, and then it's quite amazing how it changes the next time. So it is actually that interpersonal skill, and then when you get people to a certain stage, you know, then it's like, okay, let's co-produce the terms of engagement. This is how we engage. And it sets a culture, you know. So you're culture setting in a way. And so,
design should liberate and heal. And it seems that that's what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. That's a big thing to say. Thank you so much.
That's fantastic. Did you want to say one final thing?
Slightly more blunt.
Thank you, that would make me less nervous.
Scale, in terms of my practice, in estate renewal and kind of large scale regeneration. So I'm interested in the size of a neighbourhood in terms of what you're talking about. So setting yourself up for success, building that trust that takes a year and is very fragile. How big is a neighbourhood? It's an overly simplistic question, but in the context of what you're talking about, is there such thing as too large a pool?
So I'll go back to Christopher Alexander. If my memory serves me right, you know, he said 4,000 people is what you need in order to, like, you can have as a 4 to 5, I think, to actually be able to have a democratic neighbourhood. But in Bow, where we had the neighbourhood plan, we had 20-something, so 20,000. So what we did in that situation was that we asked the community if they identify with smaller neighbourhoods, which would be between 4 and 5. And then we had, again, because of volunteering, didn't fully work. But I think as a system, it's interesting to have ambassadors, rotating ambassadors. You don't want to have them having power for too long, because then it becomes like territorial, then it's all mine. So it has to be a shifting, like every 2 years you have a different, it's a bit like a model and participatory governance of Siena, in, you know, where, you know, every contrada, every neighbourhood had representation in Siena's parliament, right? And it changed every 2 years or 18 months or something like that. That meant every man in the contrada was in politics at one point, at least once in there. So we have the models, they have worked, you know. We've just gone modernist, and now we just have to pull bits of it back and just look back at history of what's worked and what hasn't. So I think you can do that. I would say more than 20,000 might be, so then it's the federated. So there's a wonderful book called The Federated Neighbourhood, or there's a lot around that, because in America there was a massive movement in the 70s, I think, 80s around it. And the governments put a stop to it. But I don't know ins and outs of it. But I think in America, actually, there are some interesting models still in terms of these federated neighbourhoods. That they talk about it all the time. Yeah.
For unpicking the intricate art and craft of commoning practice for us all. I've wanted to invite you to speak here for so long, and we finally made it happen.
Thank you so much.
It's been incredible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and
big
thank you
hand
for bearing with us.